Hi, my name is Lyla, and I'm 36 years old. Last month, I walked into a company meeting expecting a normal update, and instead watched my boss present the project I spent a year building, as if it was his. My whole world went quiet in that moment, but he had no idea what was coming next. Tell me where you're watching from, and hit subscribe for more stories about workplace drama, quiet courage, and real-life revenge. I still remember the exact sound the conference room door made when I pushed it open that morning, soft, but sharp enough to make a few heads turn. Mondays were usually predictable in our Minneapolis office. People carried their coffee cups like lifelines, shuffling from one meeting to another. But that particular Monday carried a heaviness I couldn't name yet. If I had known what waited behind that door, I would have taken a breath longer, steadier, maybe even braced myself. But I walked in casually, clutching my notebook, believing I was about to give the biggest presentation of my career. The room was already full, coworkers scattered around the long wooden table, laptops open, eyes dull in that early morning way. I looked for an open seat, smiling politely at those who nodded at me. I spotted my friend Jenna, who gave a quick wave and gestured to the empty chair beside her. I started toward her, but halfway there the projector screen caught my eye. A bright slide sat at the center. The title hit me like a cold wave. Optimized Predictive Analytics Model, presented by Michael Grant. My hand stopped midair. My throat tightened. That was my project. The formatting, the structure of the slide, even the shade of blue in the title banner. I recognized every detail because I created the entire thing. I spent 11 months working on it, fine-tuning the model late at night, eating dinner over spreadsheets, testing variables until my eyes watered. I blinked, wondering if maybe I misread it. Maybe this was a coincidence. Maybe it was a similar name, a similar idea. But then the next slide changed automatically. And there it was. My diagram. My chart. My color coding. My exact layout. I felt something inside me crack. Not loudly but sharply, like a small branch snapping under pressure. My boss, Michael, stood at the front of the room wearing his usual confident grin. He didn't even look nervous. He clicked through the slides with an ease that made my skin prickle. And when he opened his mouth to speak, the room fell silent. "This is something I've been developing for the last several months," he said, his voice steady, polished. "I believe it will streamline our data workflows and help us beat our competitors by a significant margin." I stared at him, stunned. My vision blurred at the edges. My mouth felt dry. He said, "I've been developing." The words echoed in my chest like a slow, heavy thud. Jenna leaned toward me and whispered, "Lyla, isn't that your?" I shook my head slightly, unable to speak. Not because I wanted to deny it, but because I didn't trust myself not to break down right there in front of everyone. My heart wasn't pounding fast. It was doing the opposite. Slow. Heavy. Like it was sinking. I forced myself into the seat next to her, gripping the armrest so tightly my knuckles turned pale. As he explained the core features of the project, I felt a strange out-of-body sensation, as if I was watching a stranger present my dreams, my nights of lost sleep, and my small private victories. He didn't stumble. Not once. He didn't hesitate or show guilt. He sounded proud, comfortable even. That comfort was what cut the deepest. When he reached the section describing the predictive engine, I almost laughed. He didn't even understand how that part worked. I taught him the basics 2 weeks ago when he asked for insight on workflow automation. I offered help genuinely because that's who I was. Helpful. Team-oriented. Cooperative. Now he was standing there, describing the feature as if he had built it line by line, formula by formula. When the room burst into applause at the end, I didn't clap. I couldn't. The sound felt distant, muffled by the pounding in my head. My stomach twisted with something sour. Anger, disbelief, humiliation, all tangled into one tight knot. Michael made eye contact with me for a brief second. Just 1 second. But it was enough. He looked at me the way a person glances at someone they already calculated and dismissed. A quick, smug flicker. Like he'd already rehearsed this moment and decided I was irrelevant to it. I felt a cold wave rush through me. He knew what he had done. And he didn't care. As people stood to stretch and talk excitedly about the new direction of the company, I sat frozen, staring at the slide that stayed on screen far too long. A piece of me wanted to walk up there and rip the cable out. Another part wanted to scream, But the stronger part, the part of me that had always swallowed my feelings at work, kept me glued to the chair. Jenna touched my arm gently. Say something to him. You should. No, I whispered, barely audible. Not here. She nodded, understanding. The meeting wrapped up. People filed out in small clusters, buzzing with energy. I stayed behind, letting the room empty until only 3 people remained. Michael, a senior analyst, and me. He closed his laptop slowly and turned toward me. He wore a relaxed smile, as if nothing unusual happened. Morning, Lyla, he said casually. Everything okay? It took all my strength not to snap. You presented my project. He paused, blinked once, then shrugged. You contributed to some parts, sure. But leadership wanted someone more experienced to handle the final presentation. My lips parted in disbelief. I built it. He lifted his bag, slinging it over his shoulder. Let's not make this a big deal. You're still young in your career. There will be other opportunities. Young in my career? I was 36. I had been in data analytics for 12 years. He started toward the door. Anyway, I need you to focus on smaller support tasks for the next phase. I'll send you a list. My breath hitched. Smaller tasks? Support tasks? After he had stolen everything? I stood up. Michael, you know this is wrong. He turned back with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It's the corporate world, Lyla. Sometimes leadership has to take charge of projects. Happens everywhere. With that, he walked out, leaving the scent of stale coffee and betrayal lingering in the air. I sank back into my chair after he left, feeling the full weight of everything crash onto my shoulders. I stared at the empty doorway, wishing he would turn around, admit what he did, apologize, something. But the hallway remained still, quiet. For a long time I didn't move. The morning sunlight streamed through the glass walls, hitting the conference table in bright lines. I remember thinking how cruel it was that the world looked so normal while mine had cracked open. When I finally stood up, my legs felt unsteady. I gathered my notebook, though I didn't remember opening it, and left the room. I walked past coworkers who were still talking excitedly about Michael's big breakthrough, and each comment felt like a tiny sting. By the time I reached my desk, my heart felt heavy but determined. Something inside me had shifted. Something subtle but strong. This wasn't the end. This was the moment I stopped being silent. This was the moment I decided that if he wanted to steal my work, he would eventually have to face the truth. And he would never see it coming. I returned to my desk after the meeting feeling hollow, carrying a strange mix of disbelief and simmering anger. The sunlight hitting my monitor felt harsher than usual, and the quiet hum of the office felt almost accusatory, like it was reminding me of what I just endured. My hands hovered over the keyboard, but I couldn't focus on anything. I kept thinking about Michael's smug smile, the way he looked at me as if my effort was insignificant. That look, so casual, so calculated, it nagged at the back of my mind all morning. As I sifted through my emails trying to find a thread of normalcy, I began noticing small things I had overlooked before. Little hints that maybe this wasn't an isolated incident. Files from months ago, marked draft, had suddenly been deleted or renamed. Notes I remembered sharing casually in team meetings were no longer in the shared folder, or had been modified without comment. At first, I chalked it up to mistakes or miscommunication, because I wanted to believe in honesty and decency. But slowly, a pattern began to emerge. During lunch, I sat at the cafeteria table with Jenna. She was busy with her sandwich, her eyes darting around as if she were about to share a secret she didn't fully trust me to handle. Lyla, she whispered, leaning closer. You weren't the first. He's done this before. I froze mid-bite, the taste of turkey and mustard gone bitter in my mouth. What do you mean? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, not wanting others at nearby tables to notice. Jenna glanced around and lowered her voice further. Several people have lost credit for their projects. It's subtle. He tweaks files, changes authorship tags, or just takes the idea straight to the boss above him. People are scared to talk. I nodded, though a sinking feeling filled me. I had always been observant, detail-oriented. How had I missed this? I thought I knew the office dynamics, but it seemed I had been blind to a deeper undercurrent. That afternoon, I walked back to my desk and reviewed older projects. I opened files I had worked on last year, noting which ones Michael had reviewed or contributed to. My stomach twisted when I realized how many of my ideas, drafts, and concepts had been quietly co-opted. The metadata on some documents showed minor edits from him days after I finished, but nothing indicated he had authored the foundational work. Those little changes were always enough for him to claim credit, for someone less diligent to believe it was his. As I continued combing through old emails and shared documents, a pattern became painfully clear. Every project I had poured myself into, and several that I hadn't, bore evidence of a subtle manipulation. Files would vanish from folders I had full access to. Drafts would reappear with minor changes and a new author name. Praise would be redirected in meetings, usually with a small compliment to me, just enough to avoid suspicion, but never credit enough to acknowledge my original work. I began keeping a notebook, an old leather one I hadn't used in years. I listed dates, project names, minor edits, unusual email behavior, and conversations I remembered. Each line made me more anxious but strangely also more determined. For the first time, the anger that had been simmering transformed into something actionable. That evening, I stayed later than usual, the office mostly empty except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional echo of cleaning staff in the hallway. I reviewed a project Michael had submitted 2 months ago, a collaborative tool I had originally proposed. The more I looked, the more I noticed small inconsistencies. Subtle code changes I knew I hadn't made, formatting shifts, phrases he used that were strikingly similar to mine. My mind raced, connecting dots I had previously ignored or dismissed. Suddenly, a message popped up on my screen. It was from an old colleague, Tom, who had left the company months earlier. "Hey Lyla. Heard about the meeting." Michael, "Yeah, he has a history. Let me know if you want details." "You're not alone." I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. This wasn't just paranoia. This wasn't a one-time betrayal. Michael had a track record. And somehow I had been oblivious or maybe just too trusting. I felt a wave of rage, but beneath it, a strange sense of relief. At least now I knew the truth. The next morning, I decided to pay closer attention to the office chatter. I overheard 2 coworkers talking near the printer, speaking in hushed tones. "I can't believe he took credit again. And you know what? HR will never do anything. He's untouchable." "Yeah, I know. But did you see how Lyla reacted yesterday? She didn't say a word. Brave, I guess. Or just stunned." I felt a shiver run through me. Brave? Stunned? Both, I realized. And both would fuel me to be more cautious, more calculated. Over the next week, I started documenting every interaction, every small hint that Michael had interfered with someone else's work. I noted the projects he claimed as his own, the subtle manipulations, the praise he redirected. Each entry added weight to a growing realization. This wasn't incompetence, it was deliberate. During a casual coffee break, I approached a coworker named Priya, someone I had worked closely with on a small data initiative. "Hey Priya, have you ever noticed Michael taking credit for things he didn't do?" I asked gently. Priya's face paled, and she glanced around before speaking in a low voice. "Yes. I thought it was just me being paranoid at first, but he did it to my project last quarter. Nobody said anything because he's persuasive. People think it's normal." I nodded slowly, feeling a mix of vindication and sorrow. I wasn't imagining things. The office culture had allowed this behavior to thrive, and I had been too polite, too cautious, too trusting. That evening, I found myself replaying the timeline in my head. The small overlooked signs, the missing files, the edits I hadn't authorized, the subtle redirection of credit. Everything suddenly made sense. And the weight of it all wasn't just about my project being stolen. It was about years of careful observation and effort being quietly dismissed. But alongside that weight, a plan began to form in the back of my mind. If he had done this to multiple people, he had left traces. There were emails, server logs, timestamps, all of which could be used as evidence. I didn't have to confront him blindly or let this simmer in my chest. I could be deliberate. I could be strategic. Late one night, as the office cleared out, I pulled up a folder labeled Archived Projects on the shared drive. I started comparing timestamps, authorship, and edits. Small patterns leapt out at me. Files would be opened immediately after I uploaded them. Minor formatting changes appeared, and new versions were circulated with his name attached. It was meticulous and subtle, But it was unmistakable. He had created a system of theft and he wasn't sloppy. He had simply never expected anyone to notice. I also noticed how careful he was about optics. He made it appear that he was involved from the beginning, that he guided the project, that his contributions were essential. But the metadata, the raw drafts, told a completely different story. I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was my chance to fight back, but on my own terms. The following morning I shared a quick, innocent comment during the team check-in, asking about project ownership and final edits. Michael's eyes flicked toward me, and I caught a glimpse of his brief irritation. He wasn't used to me questioning him, subtly of course, without making it obvious. That small flicker, almost invisible, gave me a sense of quiet satisfaction. Over the next few days I continued documenting everything meticulously. I created a timeline noting every project he touched, every small theft, every redirected praise. I even added notes about coworkers' hushed conversations and warnings. Each entry, no matter how minor, contributed to a clear, undeniable picture. The final realization hit me on a Friday afternoon. As I organized my notes, I looked around the office at the hum of activity. The bright fluorescent lights, the low murmur of keyboards, the soft clinking of coffee mugs. It all felt normal, mundane. But behind that mundane exterior, a system of theft and manipulation had been quietly thriving. I had spent too long being polite, too long trusting appearances. Now I could see the pattern with absolute clarity. For the first time since that initial meeting, I didn't feel hollow. I didn't feel paralyzed. I felt clarity. I understood the rules of the game now. I understood Michael's methods, his patterns, and his arrogance. And most importantly, I knew that I could turn it to my advantage, that I could prepare in a way that he would never anticipate. I closed my notebook slowly, the leather cover warm under my hands. The anger, the betrayal, the shock, they were still there, but beneath it, a new determination was taking shape. I would watch, I would gather proof, and I would reclaim what was rightfully mine. I wouldn't shout. I wouldn't make a scene. I would be methodical, precise, and patient. And as I left the office that evening, the chilly Minneapolis air hitting my face, I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and purpose. The signs I had missed for so long were now painfully clear. The pattern was undeniable. And I finally understood that knowledge, when used wisely, could be more powerful than anger or confrontation. For the first time in weeks, I walked home feeling quietly in control. I was no longer just the person whose project had been stolen. I was the one who had seen the pattern, who had noticed the small signs, who was beginning to plan a response that Michael could never predict. And that realization, bitter as it was, gave me a strength I hadn't known I possessed. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. The sky was still gray, the Minneapolis air crisp, carrying the faint scent of melting snow from the weekend. My footsteps echoed softly through the mostly empty parking garage, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of purpose that was sharper than the lingering sting of betrayal. The memory of Michael presenting my project as his still burned in my mind, but today I wasn't just thinking about it, I was planning. I settled into my desk, booted up my laptop, and opened the folder I had carefully maintained over the past week. Months of metadata, timestamps, and document versions were neatly organized. A web of evidence I had started piecing together slowly but deliberately. As I scrolled through each file, my pulse quickened. Patterns I had glimpsed before now appeared in stark clarity. Every instance of subtle alteration, every file renamed under his name, every email he had forwarded to leadership without attribution, it was all trackable. The most important tool in my arsenal was something I had only discovered by accident. While reviewing older spreadsheets for my notes, I noticed that the company's software automatically logged every single change in a way that wasn't visible to casual users. The metadata included creator names, timestamps, and the exact edits made. It wasn't something Michael had considered. He assumed no one paid attention to those small technical details. But I had. I spent hours analyzing these logs, cross-referencing them with email threads and version histories. Each piece of data was like a breadcrumb leading directly to the truth. I remember the first time I caught a glaring inconsistency. One of my earlier models, which I had carefully annotated and structured, appeared in a recent email from Michael to upper management. The document showed his name as the last editor, but the metadata told a different story. I had created the original file at 8:42 p.m. on a Thursday, and he had opened it 2 days later after hours. His contribution consisted of minor formatting adjustments, but he had forwarded it as though he had built the core model himself. I leaned back in my chair, trying to contain a small, almost wicked thrill. This wasn't just about proving a point anymore, it was about turning his overconfidence into his downfall. If I could gather enough evidence, the truth would become undeniable. But I had to be careful. He was sharp, meticulous, and no stranger to manipulating digital records when he sensed scrutiny. Over the next few days, I immersed myself in the hidden layers of the company's systems. I began cataloging every access log, every file modification, and every email timestamp that connected him to my stolen projects. Some nights I stayed late, the office lights dimmed except for my monitor's glow, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the server and the occasional squeak of my chair. I started noticing other employees' files with similar patterns, subtle signs that he had been co-opting their work as well. It wasn't sloppy. It was methodical, almost like a careful predator stalking its prey. One evening, I pulled up an old file from a project I had worked on 6 months prior. I noticed something curious. Someone had opened the document multiple times in the late evening, after all official work hours. The file hadn't been touched during the day, and the timestamps clearly indicated that Michael had been reviewing it in detail. He had left minor edits, innocuous enough that they seemed helpful at first glance. But I knew better. Every tiny change was a step toward claiming authorship, a silent signature he thought no one would notice. I realized then that subtlety was his greatest weapon. He relied on people not examining the technical details, assuming the surface-level edits were sufficient to make the work appear his own. That was the gap I could exploit. He never considered that someone meticulous enough, someone who truly understood the data, would notice every irregularity. The idea came to me gradually, almost imperceptibly, while sipping lukewarm coffee at my desk. What if I could create a document that looked like a routine project update but secretly tracked every access, every modification, and every copy? If I placed it strategically, I could watch him step right into the trap. He was arrogant enough to do exactly what I wanted him to do. I spent the next several evenings carefully building the bait document. It was an updated version of my predictive model, polished to perfection, just enough to appear like a critical final submission. Within the layers of the file, I embedded a small tracking mechanism, nothing invasive or illegal, just a way to log who opened it, when, and what they did. I tested it repeatedly, ensuring it would work silently, without any trace that it was monitoring access. The morning I placed the file on the shared drive, I felt an odd mix of nerves and anticipation. My heart raced as I navigated to the team folder and uploaded it under a name that sounded urgent and important. I knew he would see it, and I knew he would open it immediately. All I had to do now was wait. Within hours, my monitoring system flagged activity. Michael had accessed the file. He was making minor edits just as I expected, tweaking charts and formatting. Every click, every small adjustment was logged in real time. I couldn't help but smile quietly to myself, the satisfaction creeping in like a warm wave. He had fallen directly into my observation, and there was nothing he could do about it. Over the next few days, I continued to monitor his activity. He forwarded the document to upper management, still under his name, confident and unaware that every action was recorded. The logs provided precise evidence of what he had done, the exact time he accessed the file, the changes he made, and the emails he sent containing my original work. It was undeniable, detailed, and irrefutable. I also noticed subtle behavioral changes in him, though he remained outwardly confident. He would glance at my desk occasionally, a faint tension in his posture, perhaps sensing that I was watching more closely than before. He hadn't realized how meticulous I had become, how methodical my observations were, and that overconfidence was leading him straight into exposure. One afternoon, I confided in Jenna about the system I had set up, careful not to reveal too much. "Jenna," I whispered during a quiet break in the office, "I've been tracking the files. Every access, every edit, everything he does is logged. I think I finally have a way to show exactly what he's been doing." Her eyes widened and she leaned closer. "Lyla, that's incredible. But be careful. He's not someone to underestimate." "I know," I said softly, my voice steady but firm. "I've been careful. Every step he takes now is being recorded. He doesn't even know it. The feeling of control was intoxicating, but it also carried a weight. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about fairness, about reclaiming the work I had poured my heart and soul into. Every late night, every dataset, every formula I had perfected over months deserved acknowledgement. And now, thanks to the meticulous logs and digital trails, I had a path to prove it. One evening, I decided to review my collection of evidence from start to finish. I created a visual timeline, mapping every project he had touched, every subtle theft, every email forwarding incident, and every metadata discrepancy. Each point on the timeline told a story, connecting dots that had seemed separate before. The narrative was undeniable. Michael had systematically claimed work that wasn't his, and every step he took was recorded, silent, and precise. As I sat back, the glow of the monitor reflecting in my glasses, I felt a sense of satisfaction that I hadn't allowed myself before. The anger had evolved into strategy, and the strategy was now almost complete. The digital trail, the very thing he had never noticed or respected, was now my instrument of justice. The culmination of this effort came one late Friday night. The office was empty except for cleaning staff moving silently in the corridors. I opened the logs for the final review and scrolled through the activity of my bait document. The record was flawless. Every edit he had made, every email he had sent, every misattributed version of the file, all logged and timestamped. I could see exactly when he had opened it, the changes he attempted, and the forwarding to upper management. The realization hit me fully. The evidence was undeniable. I had him in a way that was completely objective, factual, and impossible to refute. My heart raced with anticipation. The moment I presented this to HR or management, there would be no argument, no plausible deniability. Michael's arrogance had led him to underestimate me, and that miscalculation would become his undoing. I leaned back, letting out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The digital trail was my safeguard, my secret weapon, and the key to reclaiming my work. For months I had felt powerless. For weeks, I had felt betrayed and isolated. Now, armed with data, timelines, and evidence that could not be dismissed, I finally felt the faint stirrings of empowerment. And for the first time since the initial betrayal, I felt that quiet but unmistakable thrill of hope. This wasn't a reckless gamble. It was preparation, patience, and precision. Michael had built his empire of deceit, unaware that every move was being recorded. And the day the truth came to light, he would have no defense. The digital trail wasn't just evidence. It was my declaration that I was no longer a passive observer. I had seen the pattern, I had traced it meticulously, and now I held the map that would lead to justice. The betrayal that had once felt overwhelming had transformed into focus, into determination, into a plan rooted in logic and clarity. And as I shut down my laptop for the night, stepping into the cold Minneapolis evening, I felt a sense of calm resolve. The path was clear. The evidence was indisputable, and the man who thought he could steal my work without consequence would soon face a revelation he had never anticipated. The morning sun filtered weakly through the blinds, casting thin lines of light across my desk. I arrived at the office earlier than usual, the weight of anticipation pressing on my chest like a quiet drumbeat. After weeks of meticulous documentation, late nights, and careful monitoring, I knew today might finally be the day the truth would be seen. Not just by me, but by the people who had the authority to set things right. My hands trembled slightly as I organized the folders, double-checking that everything was in order. Original drafts, metadata logs, email threads, and the digital trail I had carefully constructed. Every piece had its place. Every detail mattered. I walked down the hallway to the HR office, my steps unusually heavy. The scent of coffee and printer ink mingled in the air, grounding me in the mundane reality of the office environment. When I arrived, I found the HR director, Mrs. Callahan, already seated, sorting through a stack of paperwork. She looked up as I approached, her expression warm but professional. "Lyla," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Good morning. What can I help you with today?" I took a deep breath and sat down, keeping my voice calm but steady. "I'd like to go over a series of incidents regarding project ownership and contributions. I have documentation that I believe will clarify some misunderstandings about recent work." Her eyes narrowed slightly and she leaned forward. "I see. How extensive is this? I opened my laptop and began to explain systematically, walking her through the timeline of events. I showed her the original drafts of my projects, then the versions that had been forwarded under Michael's name. I displayed the metadata logs that documented every time he accessed the files, every minor edit he made, and every email he sent. As I spoke, I noticed her fingers tapping lightly on the desk, her focus intense. "This is very detailed," she said quietly. "It's unusual to have such a complete record, but it's compelling." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. I've also included corroborating statements from colleagues who witnessed some of the events, along with email communications that show the sequence of authorship. My goal isn't to create conflict. It's simply to provide an accurate account of who contributed what. She paused, flipping through the documents. "Lyla, this may take some time to process. I need to coordinate with the legal team and upper management to ensure everything is handled appropriately." I felt a surge of relief. For the first time, it wasn't just my observations or suspicions. The evidence was tangible, precise, and undeniable. I had done my part. Now it was in capable hands. Later that morning, a meeting was scheduled with HR, legal, and upper management. My heart pounded as I walked into the conference room. The polished table gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and chairs were arranged around it like a small arena. Michael was already there, sitting confidently, tapping his pen against a notebook. I noticed the faint line of tension in his jaw. He hadn't yet seen the full extent of my preparation. The HR director motioned for me to start. I pulled out my laptop, opened the first folder, and began walking them through the timeline of events. Every piece of evidence was clear. Timestamps, metadata, emails, original drafts. I spoke slowly, deliberately, making sure every detail was communicated without emotion clouding the facts. Michael watched me the entire time, his expression a mix of disbelief and growing irritation. I noticed his hands tighten into fists under the table, but outwardly, he maintained a calm facade. That calm facade would crack soon enough. As I progressed through the evidence, I saw subtle reactions from management. Eyebrows raised, heads tilted, fingers paused over laptops. It was clear they hadn't expected such a comprehensive presentation. I could feel the tension in the room shift. The balance was moving subtly but irrevocably in my favor. Then came the moment I had anticipated, the digital trail of the bait file I had carefully monitored. I showed them the access logs, the exact times Michael opened the file, the minor edits he made, and the emails he sent to upper management claiming credit. His eyes widened slightly just for a fraction of a second, and I felt a small, quiet thrill. "This is precise," one of the senior managers said slowly, leaning back in her chair. "It's difficult to dispute these logs. They're objective and time-stamped." I continued calmly, presenting additional examples of projects he had claimed over the past year. Each example was supported with concrete data, original drafts, and corroborating emails. As I spoke, I noticed Michael's posture stiffen, his confident smile faltering. The aura of control he had carried for months was slipping, replaced by a faint panic he tried to hide. Finally, the HR director addressed him directly. "Michael, we've reviewed the evidence presented. It's substantial and detailed. Can you explain your version of events?" Michael opened his mouth, hesitated, and then spoke in measured tones. I contributed guidance on several projects. I reviewed drafts and suggested improvements. That's all." I felt my pulse quicken. "Michael," I said evenly, "the logs and metadata show otherwise. They show original authorship, timestamps of creation, and multiple instances where the work was forwarded under your name without acknowledgement. This isn't about guidance. It's about misattribution and taking credit for work that wasn't yours." There was a long pause. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing briefly at management and then at HR. For the first time, I saw uncertainty creep into his eyes. Upper management began asking specific questions about the evidence. Were these edits substantial contributions or minor formatting and cosmetic changes? One manager asked. I responded clearly. The edits were minor. The core work, the models, the analysis, the documentation was created before he accessed the files. The logs show he made adjustments after the fact, not original contributions. As the discussion continued, Michael's composure unraveled further. He tried to interject, defend himself, but each time, the concrete evidence cut through his statements. Every email, every metadata entry, every version history I had painstakingly documented left him with fewer defenses. I watched silently as the people who mattered most, those with the power to make the final decision, absorbed the facts. There was no argument to be made, no spinning the narrative. The truth was laid bare, undeniable and objective. After what felt like hours, the HR director spoke again. Michael, based on this evidence, we need to take immediate steps to address the misattribution of work. There will be formal acknowledgement of the original authors, and the projects in question will be reassigned appropriately. Further actions regarding employment decisions will follow our internal review. Michael's face turned pale. The confident, untouchable persona he had carried for months was gone. He opened his mouth, then closed it. I could see the realization settling in. His overconfidence, his manipulation, and his disregard for fairness had finally caught up with him. For the first time, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Months of frustration, anger, and sleepless nights had culminated in this moment. I wasn't just vindicated, I was empowered. The truth had reached the people who needed to hear it, and it had done so with clarity, precision, and undeniable logic. As the meeting wrapped up, several colleagues approached me quietly, offering small smiles of congratulations and gratitude. Some whispered that they had suspected this behavior for months, but didn't have proof. I felt a sense of community, a shared acknowledgement that we had been navigating a subtle but pervasive injustice together. That evening, back at my desk, I reflected on the day. The tension in the office had dissipated, replaced by a new, cautious respect. Michael remained in the room, subdued and silent, while I felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that truth, evidence, and patience had prevailed. I realized something profound. Justice doesn't always need to be loud or dramatic. Sometimes it simply requires clarity, patience, and the courage to present facts without emotion clouding judgment. Walking out of the office later that evening, the crisp air hitting my face felt different, lighter somehow. The burden of betrayal was still there, but it no longer weighed me down. Today the truth had been seen, acknowledged, and validated. My work, my effort, and my integrity were finally recognized by the people who mattered most. And as I stepped into the quiet streets, I understood that the journey wasn't just about reclaiming credit. It was about reclaiming confidence, agency, and the power to ensure that truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way forward. The office felt unusually quiet that morning, almost serene, as I walked past the familiar cubicles. The tension that had hung like a thick cloud over the past few weeks was gone, replaced by a strange electric stillness. People moved about with subdued awareness, a shared understanding of the change that had taken place. Michael, meanwhile, sat at his desk, his usual air of arrogance replaced with cautious vigilance. He hadn't yet realized the full extent of what was coming, or that the final move was mine to make. I approached my own desk, feeling a mixture of anticipation and calm. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the gnawing frustration of betrayal. Instead, there was a clarity, a sense of purpose that had grown steadily as I prepared my plan. Every late night spent reviewing logs, every subtle observation of Michael's patterns, every careful documentation of my work had led me to this moment. The digital trail I had uncovered wasn't just evidence, it was a key, and I was about to turn it. Before anyone arrived, I opened my laptop and reviewed the final compilation I had prepared. It wasn't just the logs and emails anymore. I had created a visual timeline, connecting each project, each misattribution, and each minor edit to show the full scope of Michael's behavior. It was comprehensive, undeniable, and undeniable in its clarity. And unlike the earlier presentations to HR, this wasn't just about the facts. It was about a narrative, one that told a story of deception, arrogance, and the eventual unraveling that comes from underestimating someone who has the patience to watch and wait. I printed a few copies for management and colleagues who had witnessed his manipulations firsthand. Every page was a mirror, reflecting the work he had taken, the subtle ways he had manipulated perception, and the undeniable truth of my contribution. While Michael had believed he was untouchable, I had ensured there was no ambiguity left for anyone to misinterpret. The first person to arrive was Jenna. She dropped by my desk with a cautious smile. "Morning, Lyla. How are you feeling?" "Focused," I said simply, returning her smile with one of my own. "I've finally got everything ready." Her eyes widened slightly. "Ready for what?" "Ready to make sure the truth can't be ignored," I replied. I didn't need to say more. She nodded, a quiet understanding passing between us. By mid-morning, management had gathered for an informal review. I presented the materials quietly, handing over the printed timelines and walking them through the digital evidence one last time. There was no dramatic announcement, no emotional speeches, just a clear presentation of facts, meticulously organized. Each page reinforced the narrative. This wasn't a case of perception, it was a documented pattern of misattributed work. Michael was present but mostly silent, shifting in his seat as I spoke. I noticed the subtle signs of anxiety creeping across his face, the tightening of his jaw, the repeated glances toward HR and management, the small involuntary movements betraying his growing discomfort. He had spent months cultivating control and dominance, but he hadn't anticipated that I would wield patience, observation, and evidence against him. Once I had finished, I paused and looked around the room. Eyes that had once seemed indifferent now studied me with attention. The weight of anticipation was palpable, and I allowed a faint, controlled smile to cross my face. This wasn't just vindication. It was the moment the balance shifted, quietly, decisively, and irrevocably. The HR director cleared her throat. "Michael, based on this new presentation, we will be taking formal steps to correct the record on project ownership. Your involvement will be reassessed, and necessary actions will be taken to ensure proper acknowledgement and accountability." His face turned a pale shade of disbelief. I didn't realize," he began, faltering under the clarity of the evidence. "I thought the contributions were collaborative." "Collaborative?" I interrupted gently but firmly. "The records show original authorship, timestamps, edits, and correspondence. This isn't about collaboration. This is about work that was yours to review, not claim as your own. The logs are explicit." For the first time, he was cornered by objective facts. The arrogance that had defined him for so long was gone, replaced with a palpable sense of helplessness. The room was silent except for the soft rustle of papers and the quiet hum of the air conditioning. It was the kind of silence that signifies a profound shift, the moment when truth finally asserts itself over deception. After the meeting, a few colleagues came over privately. Some offered quiet congratulations, while others simply nodded in shared understanding. "We've suspected it for months," one whispered. "But no one had proof. Now we finally do." I nodded, appreciating their acknowledgement, but I also realized that this moment wasn't just about exposure. It was about reclaiming control not just of my work but of my own sense of agency. For months I had felt manipulated, powerless, and frustrated. But now, with the truth clearly laid out, I could step forward without anger dictating my actions. I could act with confidence, clarity, and purpose. Later that afternoon, I returned to my desk and reviewed my emails one last time. There was a formal acknowledgement from upper management correcting project authorship, a recognition of my contributions, and notes for future accountability. The sense of relief was profound, but even deeper was a realization I hadn't expected. This victory wasn't just external, it was internal. I felt lighter, freer, as though a burden I hadn't fully acknowledged had been lifted. It was then that I decided to take one final step. I scheduled a brief meeting with Michael alone, not to confront him angrily, but to observe his reaction and assert my closure. He arrived, sitting stiffly in the small meeting room, the tension in his shoulders unmistakable. "Lyla," he said, voice carefully neutral, I didn't realize the extent of the documentation." I smiled softly, keeping my tone calm. "Michael, it wasn't about catching you or humiliating you. It was about truth. About fairness. About making sure the work I put in is recognized and protected." He looked away briefly, then back at me, searching for some leverage. Finding none, he simply nodded. "I understand." That small acknowledgement, stripped of defensiveness, arrogance, or excuses, was enough. I realized that my goal had never been revenge for its own sake. It had been recognition, validation, and reclaiming my professional dignity. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't anticipated. Freedom. freedom didn't come from seeing him unsettled or from the formal corrections. It came from reclaiming my own sense of control. I had watched, I had documented, and I had acted strategically. I had used patience, observation, and logic to navigate a situation that had initially felt overwhelming. And now, the weight of frustration and helplessness that had pressed against my chest for months had finally lifted. The rest of the week felt surreal. I moved through the office with a quiet confidence, colleagues acknowledging my work in ways that felt natural rather than forced. Michael remained present, subdued, and noticeably cautious, a living reminder of what happens when arrogance underestimates careful observation. And I, for the first time in a long while, could focus on my work without the lingering cloud of betrayal and manipulation. That weekend, as I walked through the quiet streets near my apartment, I reflected on everything that had happened. The months of late nights, the careful documentation, the subtle observations, all of it had led to this point. I realized that the surprise Michael had never anticipated wasn't a confrontation, a scandal, or dramatic exposure. It was my methodical patience, my clarity of purpose, and my unwavering determination to ensure that the truth was seen by the right people. And the freedom I hadn't expected? It was more profound than any external vindication. It was the internal liberation from doubt, frustration, and self-questioning. It was the ability to trust my instincts again, to move forward without fear that my efforts would be stolen or my work dismissed. It was the quiet, profound satisfaction of knowing that I had acted with integrity, patience, and intelligence, and that those qualities were my true advantage. On Monday morning, as I returned to the office with a renewed sense of purpose, I noticed the subtle shift in the environment. Colleagues greeted me with genuine warmth, conversations included acknowledgement of my contributions, and even Michael's presence felt like a shadow of caution rather than authority. The atmosphere, once tense and clouded by unspoken resentments, was now infused with a sense of balance. I realized that this was more than professional victory. It was personal growth. I had learned the value of patience, of careful observation, and of acting with evidence rather than emotion. I had discovered the power of persistence, the importance of trusting my instincts, and the strength that comes from careful, deliberate action. And I had learned that true freedom isn't just about winning. It's about reclaiming one's confidence, agency, and integrity in the face of betrayal. By the end of that week, I finally allowed myself to exhale fully. The emails confirming corrections, the subtle acknowledgments from colleagues, and the quiet absence of tension from Michael's actions coalesced into a sense of closure. I felt lighter, not just because the injustice had been addressed, but because I had acted with intention and intelligence. The surprise had been mine to orchestrate, the victory measured not in spectacle but in quiet, undeniable truth, and the freedom it brought was far greater than I had imagined. Walking out of the office that Friday evening, the crisp air against my skin, I smiled to myself. The journey had been exhausting, emotional, and sometimes terrifying, but it had also been empowering. The betrayal that had once seemed insurmountable had been transformed into a moment of triumph, not through confrontation, but through precision, patience, and unwavering integrity. And in that moment I understood something profound. The surprise he never saw coming wasn't a trap. It was the culmination of clarity, evidence, and steadfast perseverance. The freedom I never expected wasn't granted by anyone. It was claimed through my own deliberate, measured actions. And that combination, subtle but undeniable, was far more powerful than any anger, drama, or impulsive confrontation could have ever been.